Okay, we carry on. So in 1 Corinthians, after dealing with the issue of the man who was having a sexual relationship with his father's wife, then Paul in chapter 6, verses 1 to 11, he rebukes the Corinthians for suing each other in pagan courts, for taking their disputes for resolution before pagans. He ends that section by telling them that the unrighteous, meaning those who reject the ethics of faith, those who make a mockery of their confession that Jesus is Lord, he says they will not inherit the kingdom of God. And though they previously had lived in all kinds of sin, the Corinthian congregation, the people there, they previously had lived in all kinds of sin, through the gospel of Christ, they had been redeemed, they had been rescued, they had been made holy and cleansed, and were pronounced righteous. And therefore, they need to live in accordance with that truth. They need to live like the new people that they are, to live lives of faithfulness and gratitude to God in the power of the Spirit. And then in chapter 6, verses 12 to 20, Paul again addresses sexual immorality, but this time he has a specific focus on Corinthian men who were going to prostitutes. And he begins in verses 12 through 17 by rejecting attempts that they apparently have made to rationalize that behavior. To say, what are you talking about? It's actually okay for us to go to prostitutes. So this claim that it was really no big deal. Let me read this section again and then I'll talk about it. He says, all things are lawful for me. See, the fact to put it in quotes, I'm indicating to you that I think that is a slogan that they were putting up to Paul. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. Food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food, and God will do away with both the one and the other. But the body is not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord. And the Lord is for the body, and God both raised the Lord and will raise us through his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Absolutely not. Or do you not know that the man who unites himself with the prostitute is one body with her? For it says the two will become one flesh, but the man who unites himself with the Lord is one spirit with him. Now, some of the men, obviously here in the Corinthian church, they were having sex with prostitutes, and it seems that they justified this behavior, or tried to, on the basis that the body was created for sex. It was created for sex, and that the physical was merely temporary. It was ephemeral, so it could not be of any consequence to God. And to support this idea, they use this theological slogan, all things are lawful for me. Now that probably was something that Paul had said, but he had said it in a context regarding certain dietary restrictions. You see, things that were a morally neutral matter. But they were then taking it and they were applying it to sexual restrictions. And the statement, Paul says, needed qualification even when it was applied in the context of dietary restrictions. Even then it needed qualifications. But you're taking something I said in that context and you're applying it to sexual restrictions. So he doesn't dispute or reject the statement, all things are lawful. And I think he doesn't dispute it or reject it because he probably said it. But he said it in a different context. He adds the necessary qualifications that not all things are beneficial and that he will not be mastered by anything. You see, just because something is lawful, that something is permissible, does not mean that it's always right to do it. You see, for example, when the exercise of one's freedom, one's liberty, when that will damage another person, when that's the case, well, then one needs in love to abstain from that conduct that one is otherwise free to do. And Paul is going to develop that concept in dealing with the idea of eating in the temples and idolatry. He's going to develop that concept in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And regarding the freedom to eat certain food, Paul may have said something like, food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food. See, that's a way of saying, right, that they're made for each other. Food and stomach are made for each other, and the implication is that it was not improper to ingest the food. So in the context of these dietary restrictions, you could see Paul saying food is for the stomach and the stomach is for food. They're made for each other. The implication being that there's nothing wrong with ingesting this food. And the Corinthians, they may have picked up that statement that Paul had made and then added to it in line with their spiritualized view of the resurrection that we'll see in chapter 15. And they may have added to it, food is for the stomach and the stomach is for food. And they add, and God will do away with both the one and the other. I think they added that because I can't imagine Paul saying that. Okay, so they added that, I think, which addition it serves then what? To magnify or to reinforce the moral insignificance of eating. And so that's why I think they took this statement that Paul had made, added to it to magnify the insignificance of eating. But whatever the source, the Corinthians were then, they're applying that slogan, you see, to the body's sexual appetite. They're trying to make this jump. Okay, Paul, you're fine with this. You see the body, stomach and food, that's fine. They're made for each other. Not wrong to do that. And then they're trying to jump over and apply this, you see, to the body's sexual appetite. And Paul flatly rejects that application. He rejects it. The Corinthian argument, you have to piece these things together, right? You're trying to read what Paul is saying, and you're saying, okay, what does it look like Paul is responding to? Why is he phrasing these things this way? And their argument, it looks to be something like this that they were making, okay? First, they say, look, all things are permitted for satisfying one's appetite for food. I mean, after all, the stomach and food are intended for one another. And the stomach and food have no eternal significance, because God is going to do away with them both in the end. So that's the first thing. And then from that they go, oh, by analogy, all things are permitted for satisfying one's appetite for sex. Right? It just kind of follows. All things are permitted satisfying one's physical appetite, one's hunger. All things are permitted for satisfying one's appetite for sex. After all, the bodies of men and women are intended for one another. And those bodies, they have no eternal significance because God is going to do away with both of them in the end, when the physical will be destroyed. And so already you see this spiritual sense that they have, you see, that denies the materiality of the resurrection and think that, no, all material and physical things are going to be swept away and it's going to be a purely immaterial eternal existence. And so this is part, they incorporate that into and say, given that that's the case, that all physical things are going to be done away with, this physical reality is just ephemeral, it's temporary. So it can't really be a matter of significance to God. But Paul insists that the body is not intended for sexual engagement that is immoral. Rather, the body is intended for the Lord in the sense that His work of redemption, Christ's rescue work, includes the entire person. He saved the whole person, body and spirit. The body is not irrelevant for future existence. It is not destined for destruction. Rather, it's destined for resurrection. That's why he says here, but the body's not for sexual, but for the Lord. The Lord is for the body, and God both raised the Lord and will raise us. You say, well, why is he talking about the red? That's why. He's refuting the notion that there's no eternal existence in the body, no material existence. So he's telling them, see, that that's not the case. The Corinthians, as we'll see in chapter 15, they look for a spiritual salvation. A spiritual salvation in which, see, the spirit, the non-material element of a person, would finally be divested from the body. It would escape, and then all that would be the spiritual or the non-material. And lying behind that is this Greek worldview that placed little or no value on the material order. And you see that blossom fully in the 2nd century with Gnostics, who contended that, in fact, the material world was evil. The only thing that mattered was the spiritual spark inside, and the goal was to escape the physical and get to the pure spiritual. And this is what's behind, I think, their sense that that eternity will be purely spiritual. The resurrection is purely spiritual. And because the Lord redeemed the whole person, right, who will spend eternity in resurrection bodies, because that's the truth. The body is for the Lord in the present. It is to be consecrated to His purpose and use. The body is for the Lord, which rules out sexual immorality. So Paul is saying, he's addressing this stuff and saying, in essence, this is nonsense. And he adds that the Lord is for the body, right? He says the body is for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. And I think he does that to maintain the parallel with their argument. Food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food. Okay, so he says the body's for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. And the Lord is for the body, again, in the sense that He gave Himself for the body as part of His redemptive work. He did not come simply to save souls, as we think of it. He did not come simply to save spirits. He came to save people. People, right? Who are both body and spirit. So He rescues people, not just spirits, not just certain elements of people. He rescues people. And so Paul is after that idea where they're trying to diminish and say, well, the physical doesn't really matter because it's all going to be blown away in the end. And he wants them to see that that's not true. Then in verses 15 to 17, he fortifies this assertion that the body is not for sexual immorality, but is for the Lord in the specific context of their going to prostitutes. Okay, he fortifies that truth in that context, and he argues that in uniting themselves to the Lord, in becoming Christians, they entered into a union that in some way made their bodies part of Christ's body, made their bodies extensions of Christ in this world. In some way, being a Christian ties you to Christ's body, and therefore it is absolutely mind-boggling. It is absolutely unthinkable that one should take a part of the body of Christ and make it part of the body of a prostitute. How dare you do that? That's crazy. That you would take part of Christ's body and make it part of the body of a prostitute, which is, of course, what happens in intercourse. So what he says here, he says, the two will become one flesh. So he's telling these Corinthians, what are you doing? You know, what in the world, where have you gone with this? And then he says in 18 to 20, flee sexual immorality. Every sin, whatever a man may commit, is outside the body, but the man who is sexually immoral sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you were bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body. So he tells them in verse 18, he flatly states, just flat out, the prohibition that is implicit in the argument he has been making against their attempted rationalization of going to prostitutes. He's been making it clear to them that's nonsense. But now he simply states the prohibition flatly: flee sexual immorality. Now the fact he says flee, now that says to me that he recognizes what a danger sexual immorality is. How powerful sexual immorality is. It's not something you just resist it. Just kind of bop up to it. That's okay. Just don't fall for it. He says, flee that bad boy. It's like a crocodile on the riverbank. You can't mess with it. And how many husbands and wives would have benefited if they'd have paid attention to that? How many young people would have benefited if they'd have listened to the word of the Lord and fled from sexual immorality? But our entire world tells you the essence, everything is about sexual immorality. Your whole life is about sex. That's the only thing that counts. Every message you get is that way. The truth of the Spirit of God is flee sexual immorality. And that's what Paul, he tells them. And he then offers an additional or further theological insight or theological reason, namely that sexual immorality in particular is a sin against one's own body, which body is for the Lord. Now here he says for the Lord because it's also, your body is a temple of the Spirit of God. So he adds this idea you are to flee because this particular sexual immorality is a sin against one's own body in a special way, and one's body is for the Lord because one's body is a temple of the Spirit. Sexual immorality, it is distinct as a sin against the Christian's body, understood as part of the Lord's body. Well, in what way is it a distinctive sin against one's own body? It's distinctive because it's the only sin in which an inconsistent bodily union is achieved. Doesn't mean other sins aren't significant, heinous, any of that. It simply means there is a distinctive element to this sin in that it is the only sin in which an inconsistent bodily union is achieved. That sin uniquely desecrates the temple of the Spirit, the body, by making that temple part of the body of a pagan, the prostitute. You see, this is what he wants them. I can just see Paul, and I think about Paul sometimes. Paul, who labors to plant a church, and then Paul comes and you see the kinds of issues he's got to deal with, and I could just see the guy just going, but he just keeps pitching. He just keeps working, saying, no, that's crazy. You can't be doing that. You can't be doing that. And then the bottom line you see is that our bodies belong to the Lord, right? He says, who's in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own. That's not what the world's telling me. The world's telling me I'm autonomous. I have complete control. You have nothing to say. No one has anything to say about what happens with my body, what I do with my body. I'm the king and the ruler of my body. I'm autonomous with regard to my body. No, you're not. I don't know what to tell you. You're not. He says here, you're not your own. You were bought with a price, Christian. You were purchased. So then he says, as a result, what you do with your body, which is not yours, it belongs to the Lord who bought it. You glorify God with your body. And in this context, that means avoid sexual immorality. That's not the only thing. Anything you do with your body, you do it to glorify God. But that certainly means you do not engage in sexual immorality. Okay? You do not do that. You use your body to glorify God. In chapter 7, now about which things you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. See the quotes again? But because of the cases of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to the wife what is due, and likewise also the wife to the husband. The woman does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not cheat one another, except perhaps by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and then be together again. Do not cheat one another, so that Satan not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say as a concession, not as a command. Now I wish that all men were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, the one this and the other that. So, with these words here where he says, now about which things you wrote. Okay, so Paul, he now moves to his response to the things they wrote in their letter to him. So remember, they'd written to Paul. And so Paul now he's talked about things he knows from other sources. Now he turns his attention to what they had said in their letter to him. And this phrase, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, well, that means not to have sexual relations with a woman. Okay? And you see it's rendered that way, just not to confuse, so as not to confuse modern readers instead of saying touch, or as I did it literally. Instead of saying that, you see, for example, it's rendered not have sexual relations with in the English Standard Version, the New English Translation, the NIV, the Christian Standard Bible, because they don't want you to be confused and think literally he's talking about it's good not to touch. Not in this context. He's using it as a euphemism for sexual relations. And that phrase, that's what that means. It's probably that phrase, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, not to have sexual relations with a woman. That's probably a slogan that some people in Corinth, some of the Christians in Corinth, were using to urge cessation of sexual relations within marriage. They're saying, hey, it's good not to have sexual. You know, if you're really spiritual, if you've really made contact with the above, well, then it's good just to stay off all that physical. You know, it's good to abstain from. And so they're using this idea. It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, in arguing that it's good for you not to have sexual relations within a marriage. And Paul's quoting from their letter here where they say it's good for a man not to touch a woman, at least the sentiment, if not the actual language. And the note in the New English Translation, it says, Greek, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, a euphemism for sexual relations. This idiom of touching a woman, this idiom occurs 10 times in Greek literature, and all of the references except one appear to refer to sexual relations. Many recent interpreters believe that here again, Paul cites a slogan the Corinthians apparently used to justify their actions. If this is so, and I think it is, Paul agrees with the slogan in part, right? Of course he does, because there are many contexts in time when it is good not to have sexual relations with a woman, right? So you can't just say that's not true. No, it is true in a lot of contexts, but not in the context of marriage. So he says, Paul agrees with the slogan in part, but corrects it in the following verses to show how the Corinthians misused the idea to justify abstinence within marriage. See, so this is just another manifestation, it's another expression of their misguided spirituality. This idea, you know, no, we're really in contact with the above and belittling of the present or this physical aspects. So it has this negative attitude toward the material world and the body. And so they're saying, no, if you're really spiritual, that's okay. That's okay for like the children or something, like somebody who's just a young Christian. But when you really understand, the spiritual person is abstaining. He's transcended sex within marriage. That's when you're really spiritual. Something like that's what's going on. Okay? You pick that up. According to Gordon Fee in his commentary, he expresses their position, the Corinthian position. This is how Fee expresses it. Since you yourself, Paul, are unmarried and are not actively seeking marriage, and since you've denounced porneia, sexual immorality, in your letter to us, is it not so that one is better off not to have sexual intercourse at all? After all, in the new age, which we've already entered by the Spirit, there's neither marrying nor giving in marriage. Why should we not be as the angels now? You see, so this is what this idea of this over-realized eschatology. There are people who think that's not really an issue going on in court. Many people who think it is an issue. I think it is an issue. In other words, I think they are viewing our present life, too much in terms of the not yet. Okay? And I think you have it reflected here in what Fee is saying about their position. Now, Paul, he doesn't deny their slogan. Because as I say, in certain situations, in many situations, right? It is good for a man not to have relations with a woman. But as a justification for denying sex within marriage, or as a justification for divorce, or as a justification for not getting married, Paul will have none of it. Okay? He'll have none of that. You can take, yes, there's truth in this statement, but the way you're using it is wrong. So in verses 2 to 4, he qualifies their slogan by making clear that what they're saying, that slogan, it cannot be used properly to restrict full sexuality within marriage. It cannot be used to restrict that because of the instances of sexual immorality. He says, but because of the cases of sexual immorality. Because of the instances of sexual immorality that were occurring in the church there. See, because of that, for example, going to prostitutes, what he just written about, because of that, they have to stop urging abstinence on married people. Coming to them and saying, what's really spiritual is that you abstain from sexual relations. He says you're going to be fueling something that's not good. And that's what you're doing in your false notion of spirituality. You see, they have to permit each man to have his own wife sexually. That's what he's talking about. You can't push abstinence on them in the name of spirituality. You must permit each man to have his own wife sexually, and you must permit each woman to have her own husband sexually. You see, to have a wife is different than to take a wife. And the verb to have, it was used as a euphemism for having sexual intercourse. You see it in a number of places in the Septuagint. You see it in some text in the New Testament. David Garland, in his commentary, he says, the immediate context with the reminders about what is owed in marriage, the assertion that husbands and wives have authority over one another's bodies, and the command not to deprive one another makes clear that the phrase, let each one have his own wife or her own husband, refers to sexual relations within marriage, not getting married. He's talking about married people who are being urged to abstain with this false spirituality. He's saying, do not do that. Let each man have his wife sexually, each woman have her husband sexually. And don't be raining on that and discouraging that and telling them that somehow they're doing something unspiritual in that. You see? And that means a full conjugal life with one's spouse. Right? The husband is to give his wife her due. And likewise, the wife is to give her due to the husband. What he is due. Each is sexually obligated to the other. You hear that? In marriage, each is sexually obligated to the other. Right? In marriage, one does not have authority over one's own body to do with it as one pleases. That's not how it is. One's spouse has authority over one's body. So one cannot deprive the spouse of sexual relations. Now, in every marriage, you say, well, what does that mean practically? Okay, if we're going to talk about frequency and all of that kind of thing, all marriages work that out. Right? All marriages work that out to where there's joy together and there's satisfaction together. Okay? But at some point, do you see the principle of the contract? You say, well, when does the level of frequency amount to depriving? Okay, well, those are the kinds of questions. Everything gets cloudy at the border. But the concept, don't miss the concept, you see, as you work those things out. Just understand that you are sexually obligated to each other. It's not like, hey, I'll do you a favor. Obligated to each other. And that's how God has designed it in marriage. And the point of verse 5 is that they have to stop cheating one another in that regard. You see, under the influence of these people who perceive themselves to be spiritual, who are urging them to abstinence within marriage, they're cheating each other of what they owe each other. They're withholding sexual relations from each other because this misguided idea, that's what it means to be a really spiritual Christian. Okay, and he says that they're not to cheat, they have to stop that, and they have to stop that so that Satan might not tempt them because of their lack of self-control, as is evident in the ongoing cases of immorality. He said, what are you doing? You've got this appetite here that God has provided for mutual satisfaction, and you're telling the people not to do that, and what you're doing is you're creating a monster. And with so much sexual immorality going around, that's really a bad idea. Then he says that a possible exception to that is if they want, as a couple, if they want to agree to abstain from sexual relations for a period of time in order to devote themselves fully to prayer. He says if you as a couple choose to do that, that's fine. But he says that's a concession for those who choose to do so. That is not a command that you have to do that. But if you choose to do that, that's okay. If that's something the couple wants to do. And then Paul says that he wishes all people had his gift of freedom from the need of sexual fulfillment that made it possible for him to live unmarried. Okay, so Paul says, I wish that everybody had that. But he realizes, however, that his celibacy is a gift. It's not a requirement. Not everybody has that. So he says, so when you are pushing that on people, when you are coming to people and say, well, look, Paul's not married. Paul's not looking to get married. He says you can't take that and then push that on married people and be telling them to abstain from sexual relations within the marriage. You're doing something that's really wrong and bad. See, celibacy is for those gifted to be celibate. So they can't use Paul's situation to urge celibacy on the married. That's just wrong for them to do that. And it's going to create all kinds of ancillary problems. And then he says in 7, 8, and 9, now I say to the widowers and to the widows. Okay? Now, your translation won't say widowers unless you look at the footnote in the NIV. Literally here, it means unmarried. It's tois agamois is the word, okay? That's what the word is. It's from the adjective agamas, okay? But it means literally unmarried. But in this context, I think it means widowers and widows. Those are the two I think he's talking about here in verses 8 and 9. He says, now I say to the widowers and to the widows, it's good for them if they remain as I also do. But if they are not exercising self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn. Okay, now having just spoken, right, of his gift of celibacy, having just spoken of that, Paul speaks to those who are in his situation of no longer being married, but who lack his gift of celibacy. So he's speaking to these widowers and widows who are in that situation, but who lack his gift of celibacy. And I believe that in these verses, as I say, I think he's addressing widowers and widows. That word that he uses there, which I say literally means unmarried, I know that. But it literally means that. But that word was used at this time to refer to widowers. Okay, so I know the word can have that meaning. That's within its range of meaning. And I think it has that meaning here when I look at the context. This translation, if you go with widowers, it explains the mention of widows. Right? If you take agamos here and simply say it means unmarried, and you say, well, at first it means all unmarried people, all single people, men or women. Well, then you say, well, the widows are already covered. So we're going to say all unmarried people and the widows. And you're going, that doesn't seem to really go very well together, right? And you also have a problem if you take that route, why Paul separately addresses certain unmarried women. In verse 25, the virgins. So he's already dealt with them, addressed them. So why would he do that? Why do you speak of the widows separately? Why would he speak of the virgins separately? So that just doesn't make much sense to me. Now, if you say, well, maybe it just refers to all unmarried men, all single men, not all single men and women, but just all single men. But then the widows isn't a balanced contrast. It just says, okay, I'm taking all single men, however they're single. Okay? Widow, divorced, never married. And then I'm going to contrast them with widows. It just doesn't seem very balanced. And the way Paul deals with husbands and wives in mutuality throughout the section, it seems reasonable to think that he would maintain that balance here. So I think he's talking about widowers and widows, and I think that translation makes better sense out of Paul's flow of thought. Because with that translation, then you see that in verses 1 to 16, that those deal with those who are presently or formerly married. And then in verses 25 through 38, he deals with the never before married. So it makes better sense to me that way. And Paul's use of the word agamos in verse 11 and in verse 34 suggests that for him, it normally means not the unmarried in general, but the demarried. You see, the demarried, those formerly, but not now married. So all of those things make me think that widowers here is the way to go. In fact, given that men in Jewish society, they normally married, especially those who were respected religious figures, Paul may well have been married at some point. His being a widower, for me, for my money, fits best, most naturally with the reading of verse 8 where he says, now I say to the widowers and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain as I also do. So it sounds to me like he's one of them, okay, that he was in fact a widower, but that's not airtight. Okay, people debate this, and that's not airtight. It's possible he was never married, but it kind of smells like it to me there. All right, let me give you some scholars, because when I do widowers and you're reading in your Bible, it says, my Bible says unmarried. What's this guy doing? Okay, I tried to explain why I'm doing that. But let me show you, this stuff's not eccentric. Let me just give you a few scholars. I could have added to this, but I don't want to drive you crazy. Okay, Gordon Fee, on balance, therefore, widower seems to be the best understanding of the word here. Craig Blomberg, in his commentary, we should probably understand the unmarried here to refer to men whose wives had died. Raymond Collins, in his commentary, paralleled with widows, the term tois agamois connotes a specific group of unmarried men, namely widowers. Richard Hayes, the word unmarried here is used here to refer specifically to widowers, not in a generic fashion to include all those who are not married. Okay, so I'm with them. I just say, you see, it's not eccentric, it's not weird. Okay, I'm not taking you down some internet channel. I'm giving you something that I think is quite reasonable and makes the most sense to me. So, now I could have added quite a few others to that, but I didn't. All right, now to those who've lost a spouse by death, Paul says it's good for them to stay unmarried as he does. It's a good thing. Okay, you're a widower, you're a widow, that's a good thing. That represents a good choice, but it is not something that is commanded. He's simply saying that's okay. That's good. You know, that's a good thing, right? As he says in verses 39 to 40, a widow is free to marry in the Lord. Right, so clearly he's not saying you can't do that. He's simply saying it's a good thing. It's an okay option. If you choose to stay unmarried, okay, that's good. That's good. He's not saying you can't get married. Like I said, free to marry in the Lord, meaning to marry a Christian. But he believes there, he says, that she will be happier if she remains a widow. Not binding that. He's just saying that. Now, this advice doesn't apply, however, to those who are not exercising self-control. So I have widowers and widows, those who've been married for a good while, had a conjugal life, spouse dies. You know, it's a good thing if you go ahead and live unmarried. But, you know, if in fact, you're winding up having difficulty, you're not exercising self-control, and Paul, see here, he probably has in mind some who are doing the same things as some of the married people were in verses 1 to 7, practicing sexual immorality by going to prostitutes. If you're not exercising self-control, if you're not doing that, well, then the idea of your staying unmarried, it's not a good idea in your case. You see, it's not a good idea. The antidote for such sin, for this lack of exercising self-control, is to get married instead. You see, and you note that the power of sexual desire, oh, this is going to ring. 0. I see now... That's how it goes. Next week, Lord willing, thanks.